a great set of questions. And we should keep the conversation going. Your work is to breathe new life into stereotypes. You just asked for me a really such an expansive question. So clearly I'm struggling trying to boil that down. As you walk around the chapel, it feels like that form is in many ways alive and completely elastic and breathing. I'm not interested in answering the question with a singular answer. I'm interested in architecture creating those potential connections, but leaving open the possibility of that question and answer constantly evolving. As an architect, your mind needs to constantly be involved and intertwined with your larger project. I'm most interested in the way that architecture has the potential to be at the center of connecting disparate things. I think one of the most significant spatial problems of our generation is that of simultaneity. Intense. Why do you want to know?
Hello, Michael.
Vladimir, how are you doing?
Very good. Thank you so much for agreeing to this conversation. And
happy to do it.
Yeah,
do it.
Yeah. I watched. Apart from attending your lecture last time at Pratt, I actually saw a number of articles and talks and discussions. I understand that you gave talks at Pratt before as well. So
I did. That was before the pandemic.
Yeah,
David Erdman.
I think it was 18.
Yeah, David Erdman was running a series, and Greg Pasquarelli. There were group pairings, and so Greg Pasquarelli and then myself each gave short talks, and then we had a conversation.
Yeah, there were some interesting observations. I remember a little bit unusual, not unusual maybe for that time, because the conversation about architecture keeps kind of shifting, and what people used to say in 2018, 2012, and even before that appears to be radical. And I imagine what are we going to be talking about in like 2025, 2028, it's going to become very mellow, and I don't know. But the past seems to be very radical.
Maybe for each moment, the conversations in architecture and the way that they relate to a contemporary conversation or debate might seem very intense or radical because they're so topical. They're related to the crises or the issues or the concerns of the moment. Architecture has a much longer scale, of course, and that I think is one of the important parts about looking at architecture even in the past, to both understand it as a response representing its particular moment, but also its relationship to the long arc of long trajectory of architectural thinking.
As you were saying this, I thought about the fact that it seems like, we can all admit that we're living in a crisis all around, everywhere, just about every day we wake up, we don't know what else is going to happen. But because architects are so much focused on the crisis overall, architecture as a profession completely gets ignored, and nobody talks about it any longer.
Hmm.
And so many people said recently, leading architects, they would say, I'm not interested in architecture. And everybody is applauding to that.
Hmm.
And that's why we are in crisis. Not because everybody is in crisis, but we are in crisis as far as the profession, because we're not paying attention to it at all.
I believe that well, I think you can look at architecture through the lens of it as a profession, and you can look at it through the lens of it being a discipline. And I don't think those are just semantic differences. The role of the profession of architecture and its relationship to culture, to economies, to politics, but also to itself as a business model, is one very particular thing. Architecture is a discipline, and its relationship to, again, its long history, and the way in which that the response to moments throughout that history, the way in which the response has transformed architecture, is also extremely important. I'm at a point where, in many ways, I'd say I believe in architecture's capacity from a discipline standpoint, maybe more than I ever have uh, in the past. I'm more skeptical about architecture as a profession than I probably ever have been in the past. And I think that's a part of the crisis in the conversation in architecture, if you can call it a crisis right now, especially for a younger generation of architects, because the profession and what its economics are, what accessibility to that profession is, what the sustainability is for people within that profession, what the hierarchies have been and how they need to change, where control lies. Those are all really significant issues, but they're really rooted in the profession's role today, and have many of the same cultural and social questions that you see in all parts of the world. But I think it's important for us to also look at architecture as a discipline, and what its power actually is, because it seems to me that much of architecture's inherent capability and power is located in the discipline, not particularly in the profession or the business of architecture.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you say about young generation. It seems like the young generation is not in crisis because it's a different profession. But the older architects who were concerned with the discipline, and now, it's all thrown out of the window, they are the ones who are in crisis. And I walked through, for example, Venice Biennale exhibitions with well-known architects, and there's a disconnect. They are like, what is all of this? Do you know what is it all about?
Right.
And then we are asking all the big questions, and they say, well, okay, it's just another exhibition. We're not really here for that. We just want to see friends. And everybody is complaining. Older architects are kind of complaining that they're no longer relevant. well-known, less well-known, but the ones that were preoccupied with the language of architecture.
Hmm. The that gets back probably to the challenge of topicality in architecture. I, I think it's reasonable. Well, architecture has always represented. What it's represented has changed over time. But we're at a moment where the debates around architecture, the conversations around architecture are, of course, connected to many of the contemporary debates and questions in society as a whole. The questions that are being asked by a younger generation and the anxieties that are being felt within the profession around around those hierarchies and or those hierarchical structures are naturally being called into question the way that they are in all parts of culture and society today. I think that's inevitable. I don't know that that makes architecture less relevant. I think it's as relevant, maybe even more relevant. But the challenge is that the architect as personality, that relevancy has been challenged. But I don't know that architecture as a discipline or architecture as an act or architecture as a presence in culture is under assault. I think the roles of architecture are being rethought, recast, reinvented, especially by a younger generation, and that's that's unnerving. It creates a lot of anxiety, but it's also an inevitability. If architecture itself comes out stronger from that, even if a lot of the hierarchies change, it's it's um, it's good for architecture. It's powerful for architecture.
I have some questions I came up with. So the first question I want to ask you is, I understand that it was visiting your friend's family's house that kind of initially triggered your interest in architecture. Could you talk about that?
I am one of those people who started to think about architecture and being an architect from a reasonably young age. I think I was 12 or 13. What I thought architecture was then and what I think architecture is now, and what I've thought architecture was along the way, obviously has changed, evolved quite a bit. At the time, my best friend, when I was about 12, his father was a industrial designer, product designer, fairly successful product designer. And in their house, which his dad had designed and was a completely different house from anything else in the neighborhood, very contemporary, split level, quite open plan. In that house, his father had a small office where he would do work at times on the weekends. And he had a drafting board set up and a lot of the drafting equipment. And we would pretend we were architects, mostly by clipping. We would draw a plan, what we thought was a plan, and we would clip out furniture and people from magazines, and we would put them in the plan and, in a way, make an environment in 2 dimensions that represented some idea about a space or a building. Um, it it was um, it, it was very simple in the way that we were doing it, but I had the first sense that you could imagine and effect a space and an experience, and that really stuck with me, even if it was an, an idea that was at a very nascent level. It was the beginnings of the thinking of what how uh, how you might what role an architect might have, um, and how you could be an architect.
And this was your own revelation, or this was explained by his father?
No, it was something that stuck in my mind. It wasn't anything that anybody told me or explained to me. It was almost a visceral feeling about it. Somehow it resonated with the way that I was already probably developing. And I think that connection, that you could not only make a space or make your own world, but that architecture somehow, I think I understood it even implicitly at the time, could be a physical manifestation of the way that you saw the world. And that sounds very simplistic, but it was a very powerful feeling, certainly at that age. And I think in many ways, you can continue to boil down how I continue to see architecture and my connection to it through that lens.
And so you studied architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design, and so was Rodolfo Machado your professor there?
He was the head of the Department of Architecture during that time. Yes.
And he was your professor as well, right?
I had Rodolfo in 2 specific classes. One was a theory class around semiotics, or studying focused on semiotics in architecture. And then I was a part of a group project that he was coordinating for a contribution to the Venice Biennale in, I guess that was the 1984 or 1985 Biennale. I can't remember what year exactly.
Yeah.
Where a series of groups were assigned cities or towns in Italy, and you did a kind of urban and architectural plan for that. And we worked on a small town city, Este, which was outside of Venice. And Rodolfo was working through a series of ideas in architecture around an idea around something he called unprecedented realism, which in a sense was a kind of combination of a deep dive into the specifics of architecture, but also an interest in formal invention at almost a surrealistic level. And those 2 classes were very influential, but really it was Rodolfo's presence across the department as a whole his intellectual ambitions for architecture, the people he invited to both teach and lecture and visit at the school, he really developed an extraordinarily spirited and critical culture at the school that was the biggest influence for me.
And did you work for his office?
I did. I worked for Jorge Silvetti and Rodolfo, who in their office on and off for a number of years. It started when I was in my first year, my second year at RISD, but my first year in architecture. And I would take the bus up to their studio and work on projects. And that continued over a number of years. And in one instance, I took some time off from school because I had run out of money to pay for tuition, and worked for Rodolfo and Jorge for about a year in their office.
So you're talking about the time during RISD or in between school?
This was right around the time that I was finishing RISD, but it was still I was still in school at that time.
So they helped you financially to graduate?
Well, absolutely, by giving me a job. I depended on a number of people during that time, quite honestly, because I never quite had enough money, and I was always having to work in the summers and taking some semesters off to keep myself afloat. And
then you went to Harvard right after you graduated, right?
I did. That next year, I started.
When was that? When did you graduate first?
85.
85.
With a from RISD, and then I started in architecture that fall, and spent the fall semester at Harvard, and then promptly ran out of money again and took a year off and worked, and then came back to school. So it took me a little bit longer to finish the graduate program because of those periodic times away from the classes.
And then, I want to ask you quite a few questions, but I need to move on. So you moved to Los Angeles right after Harvard. And
Yes.
I want to ask you about LA. So when I talked to Michael Rotondi recently, he told me, in LA, you get to invent your life. It is a city of contrast. It is a city of constant change and little memory. So do you agree? And what do you like most about the city?
I think that was more vividly true at that time. The city has continued to evolve, and still has many of the same, I think, cultural possibilities because of how constitutionally open the culture of the city is. But it's becoming more challenging, absolutely, as the city has evolved, gotten denser. It's become more difficult to be as easily I think it's become more difficult to do anything in the way that it was, at least it seemed more possible in the past. My wife and I, Amy Murphy, is a professor at USC in architecture. But we came to the city largely because we felt this sense that the East Coast was was very difficult, almost impossible for a young maker, cultural maker, to do much. The hierarchies were so ingrained that, especially in things like architecture, in a discipline like architecture, it would take you forever to do anything of substance. Los Angeles seemed much more open. There was a group of architects like Michael and Tom Main with in Morphosis, Eric Moss, Frank Gehry, that were doing work that seemed like the most radical, adventurous work, frankly, in the world at the time. And that was very attractive. And Amy was about to start film school, or was applying to film schools because she wanted to be more involved in cinema. And Los Angeles was a great center of that. It seemed to make a lot of sense to try Los Angeles. But before that, I had had a studio at the GSD with an architect from Los Angeles, Robert Mangurian.
Oh, yes.
And Robert brought us all out to see the city, to visit the city as a part of our studio. And I felt this incredible connection to the city immediately. Many of my classmates, I think, felt extremely felt bewildered and by Los Angeles, and I felt exactly the opposite. It seemed to make a great deal of sense to me, and I believe, I came to believe that that was partially because I had grown up in the earliest part of my life in a post-war suburb, Levittown, on the East Coast, and much of the what much of Los Angeles is exactly comes from exactly the same moment. It's Los Angeles is arguably a post-war suburb as well. So many of the urban mechanisms, the way that you move and engage with the city, for me felt very familiar.
Just want to quickly ask you, when you were 12, were you, by that time, you were living in Connecticut or where?
At 12, we had just recently moved from Long Island, and we were living in upstate New York, outside of Syracuse, in a very small rural town.
So that's where you saw that house, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And now, so you already mentioned Frank Gehry, so I want to ask you, so you started working at his office right away when you came to LA?
When we first moved to Los Angeles, my plan was to try to work for a much larger architect. And the reason for that was working with Rodolfo and Jorge and another firm in Boston, Schwartz Silver, as a designer in both of those firms. I had gotten a lot of experience working on smaller to medium-sized projects. But I felt like the thing that I was missing and that I was really interested in was to work at the scale of the city. I was deeply interested in that conceptually coming out of a lot of the debates about the city between modernism and postmodernism at the time. People like Rem Koolhaas were very influential, as was Aldo Rossi. There were fights uh, uh, with Leon Krier and Peter Eisenman about architecture and its role in the city. And I was deeply interested in that for architecture. I thought coming out that I would try to work for a firm doing that kind of larger scale work, which probably meant working for almost a larger corporate firm. At the time, Frank, uh, while being increasingly visible and well known in architecture, there was still the sense that the work that he was doing was smaller and medium scale work. I think the largest thing that I knew was the Air and Space Museum in Los Angeles. That original plan to work for big firms uh, got um, uh, got complicated because we were in the throes of a economic recession, and all of those big firms were not only not hiring, but they were laying people off. And I was getting interviews, but I wasn't getting any jobs. Um, at some point, I needed to get a job um, um, to survive, and I sent a second round of resumes out, um, and I sent a resume to Frank's office, and they called quite quickly. Um, I was deeply interested in his work and what he was doing. Um, but it wasn't until I went for my first interview that I realized that it was at a very pivotal moment for that office where the work was really beginning to change scale and uh, was, in fact, um, very much that new work was very much at the scale of the type of project that I was hoping to be a part of. So when I was hired, I felt um, very fortunate, even though I didn't think I would probably have a job there for very long.
And how long did you stay there?
Well, when I was first hired, they were just beginning the competition for Disney Concert Hall, and I was hired to be a part of that competition. I thought I would be there for the 3 or 4 months of the competition. Um, uh, and the odds were that we wouldn't win and they would fire me and I'd go back to plan A. But we won, and I ended up being there for a little over 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
Wow. And so you were there basically until the time you started your own firm, right? You didn't work for anyone else.
No, not in Los Angeles.
And so I wonder, so you worked with Frank directly, one-on-one.
Yes, yes, I was a senior designer.
What did you take from him? What did you learn from him?
Uh, um, and this will probably be about the last that I say about it, but uh, many people ask me what I think the most significant project was that I worked on or that Frank was doing at the time. And of course, there are extraordinary buildings that happened at that moment and continued to happen before and after I was there. But the most important thing I thought that Frank had ever made was the office itself, because um, it's a culture where there's the sense that anything is possible. And I think you need to make uh, a culture of studio, of office that um, allows for you or a group to do the work that meets their ambitions. And if you don't make that place first and continue to evolve that place, then the work is always going to be extremely difficult in terms of how it manifests those ambitions.
And I want to ask you about his house. Did you make
No,
like this?
that was before me.
Say again?
That was before me.
No, I know, but did you make a special trip to see it, or have you ventured inside?
Yes.
About it?
Frank's house was when I came out with Robert Mangurian, we came to, we visited, we visited a lot of both the well-known architecture in Los Angeles and the lesser known, but also very characteristic work in the city. And Los Angeles for many years, not so much now, but at the time, could be said to be a city where the most important or the most adventurous architecture lived in the single-family houses that had been designed from the earliest moments of modernism in Los Angeles, whether that was Irving Gill, Wright, Schindler, Neutra, the case study architects, and then that work mostly of architects in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. The house was really the experimental form for architecture. So we came out to see as many of those as possible. Of course, Frank's house was a part of that. That was at a time where you could walk up to a house and knock on the door, and very often the people who lived there, knowing that you were an architecture student or a young architect, would welcome you in and show you the house. And I saw an incredible number of really important houses by doing that. Now, I think you run the risk of having somebody shoot you if you knock on the door. So I don't think it's as possible or as open then as it was then.
So what about his house? Did you just stay outside, or did you try to and succeed to get in?
His house was radical, and I think you can see that same radical approach to architecture in each of those moments of each of those other houses by different architects at different periods historically. If you see the way that Schindler put together his houses using extraordinarily prosaic and maybe even vernacular materials that were standard building materials, and create with that startling spatial and formal compositions. I think Frank's house absolutely was a natural extension of that work, and was startling for its time. And I think in each of those houses, by those different architects, there's a extremely important lesson, which is how, as an architect, to see what already exists around you and then to see it in a different way. John Baldessari, the artist, Los Angeles artist, said something to the effect of that what an artist does is that they jumpstart your mind to see something in a fresh way, as if you're seeing something for the first time. That your work is to breathe new life into stereotypes, and I think you can see in the that line of houses from the early part of the 20th century, certainly through Frank's house, this constant attempt to do exactly that, to take such a stereotypical form like the single family house and to re-see it in a way that it breathes new life into it.
Yeah. If you could touch on some of their artists that made a big impression on you, that led to some real shifts in your work. And also, I read that Richard Serra's work is very influential on you.
Serra's work was very influential for me, especially when I was at RISD. It was at a moment when, as I had mentioned before, there was a real fight between modernism and postmodernism. And one of the things that postmodernism, at least European postmodernism, was focused on was the city and trying to find ways to make work that put, let's say, the individual back into the equation. The criticism, and this is a very broad brush interpretation of that moment, but the criticism around modernism was that it had grown into an abstraction that was extremely self-referential, and that postmodernism was trying to break that insular conversation and look back at its role in the city. I thought that was important, but I also felt that if you looked at the work at the time and the kind of formalism that was coming out of it, a kind of classical overlay as a way of planning the city, that postmodernism was really going down the same path that they had criticized modernism for, just using a different aesthetic, a more historical aesthetic. I was really interested in how the viewer connected to form and space on the ground. And Serra's work was, I thought, a extremely useful precedent, because that work was very much about the way that the form became a kind of barometer of the context around it, either the topography in a more land setting or the built environment in a more city setting, like Tilted Arc in the Javits Plaza, which eventually was destroyed. The work, it was necessary to move around that work in a kind of choreography or a promenade for the sculptural effect to really take place, that for that conversation between the context around you and your perception of it, you needed to move around that and the sculpture became, if you will, the connective element. And I was interested in whether you could design architecture that way, to step back from a kind of geometric formalism to something that was really much more about a choreography, a kind of unfolding cinematic narrative, a kind of promenade, or almost a kind of picturesque version of composition, in the way that Eveline Bois talked about the picturesque in a piece he wrote in Oppositions about Serra's work. I think being at RISD was formational in looking at work like Serra's work or other artists' work, because it was an architectural education that was located in the middle of an art school, so that your colleagues, your friends, were thinking about the world through a number of different disciplines of art, whether it was painting, sculpture, glass blowing, photography. And you took as many classes in art history as you did in architectural history. For me, that was an equal context to the way that I understood architecture. Eventually, I became interested in people like Bruce Nauman, and the way that he put form together, and composed form, often using pieces that seem to suggest very prosaic forms you found in the world, or even using found forms. And it was in the way that he put them together that startling relationships got made. And again, forced you or pushed you to see what seemed to see forms that seemed recognizable, but had such an unusual compositional set of relationships, that it really provoked questions for me. I'm pausing for a moment because there have been so many, I think there have been so many artists whose work has been influential. It's in some ways hard to develop a line, but I think someone, my friend Catherine Opie, who is a photographer, her work has been extremely influential in the way that I think about Los Angeles. Her work around identity and ideas of the formation of communities and the complexity of that in the city, or the way that she looked at infrastructure in her freeway series, as being emblematic or quintessential, iconic uh, uh, form that represents the city. Those are all works that have a very strong, consistent presence in my mind.
Yeah.
That you just asked for me a really such an expansive question. So clearly I'm struggling trying to boil that down into a more concise answer.
I find it interesting that you cited San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane as your favorite building, and I believe this is Richard Serra's also favorite building, and he to the point that he got some of his ideas from it.
That's interesting. That I actually didn't know. That I have to look up about Serra. For me, there are two things primarily that I'm fascinated by in that building. One is when you are in the chapel itself, there's a sense that space it's almost impossible to imagine its geometry, even though it's generated through such a rigorous set of geometric overlays and relationships. As you walk around the chapel, it feels like that form is in many ways alive and completely elastic and breathing. It is dynamic in a way that I think very few buildings ever achieve. Such a small space. In such a small space, the expansiveness of that of your experience is I think quite profound and emotional. The second thing is that if you look at the plan of not just the chapel but the entire complex with the adjacent spaces, the way that the corridor around the chapel works, I find it an incredibly modern or contemporary plan. It's such a formed church, and yet there's really not poche in any classical sense. The wall of the chapel, even experientially, feels quite thin. So the relationship between formed interior and exterior is really interesting to me. It's both object and space at the same time. There's in that plan a kind of equilibrium that's present between all of the spaces. They seem to be very similar in scale and adjacency. It's a space that doesn't have a traditional hierarchy. And in that sense, I find it to be very contemporary as well. It feels like those spaces live simultaneously in importance next to each other. And that the lines between them are extremely important, but not figured or formalized in the way that you would expect in a contemporary or a classical piece of architecture. I could look at that plan for hours and never get bored of it.
Yeah, this is beautiful. When you describe your work, you use such words and phrases as connections, community, ambition. You just said elastic, breathing, expansiveness, then pleasure, complexity, transparency, simultaneity, bundled forms, folding on itself, perspectival pivot, an ongoing investigation, and anticipatory scale. How else would you describe your work, and what kind of architecture do you try to achieve?
I'm most interested in the way that I'm most interested in the way that architecture has the potential to be at the center of connecting disparate things. And I think architecture has a very powerful capability in doing that. Um, it can happen in many different ways. It can happen uh, many different styles and ambitions in architecture, many different forms. But uh, at its best, architecture becomes a kind of medium between, for instance, an individual's experience and the culture as a whole that surrounds that individual, between a community and an individual, between an institution and the larger culture around it. I see that as not a static, the ambition around that, not to create a static um, uh, relationship, I'm not interested um, I'm not interested in answering the question with a singular answer. I'm interested in architecture um, creating those potential connections, um, but leaving open the possibility of that question and answer constantly evolving. And in a space like Quattro Fontane, the thing that's so profound, to me at least, is that a building that was built designed, conceived, built hundreds of years ago, um, uh, continues to um, be able to be that medium between an individual and a larger concept, a larger idea, um, and um, and to span those generations uh, and all of our expectations about our particular moment in culture, and still um, do that work, still do that job, and to do it in a way that is to do that in a way in which the experience is still um, deeply meaningful and emotional. Uh, that's in a way, that's a yeah. I guess I would leave it at that.
And your work is characterized by fragmentation and distortion, which is expressed very dynamically. I wonder where this is coming from and what is the design process like for you? Where do you start a project typically?
Can you say that question again? I'm still thinking about the last question.
Well, I said that your work is often characterized by fragmentation and distortion, and they are expressed very dynamically. So I want to know where this is coming from and what is the design process like, and where do you start typically?
I wouldn't agree that it's really about a kind of fragmentation as much as it's about the as much as it is about the composition of a series of elements that that provoke or form relationships dynamically across space. I'm very interested in the way that form uh, charges space, that uh, produces um, uh, produces a kind of dynamic space um, that uh, is not ever particularly resolved, but has a kind of equanimity or maybe even equilibrium to it. That there are balances that get made, but that it's never fully formally resolved. Uh, and in doing that, hopefully, the building, the composition, the relationship of form and space um, uh, has a more um, fluid, elastic, dynamic relationship. To do that at a very practical level, I work in the design process primarily in three-dimensional physical models. They're still a very integral part of the process. All of the work that we're doing, of course, um, is um, all of the work that we're doing is quantified using three-dimensional digital models uh, naturally, but the physical model for me is still extremely important. And the reason for that is that I think one of the um, most significant spatial problems of our generation um, is that of simultaneity, is the one of simultaneity, that multiple spaces, that we occupy multiple spaces, multiple places at the same time. And that is largely coming culturally, socially from the fact that we are connected digitally to so much of the world at the same time. You're in a room, but you're talking to your friends and you're getting information coming at you from every direction. Um, uh, I think um, that has a an impact on the way that we think about contemporary architectural space. If you could say that form in architecture is the thing that represents um, any given historical epoch, but it's actually, I think, the space um, that and the changes in the way that we think about space um, with every evolution in architecture, that's the more radical um, contribution to our understanding about um, a particular moment, a particular time, um, our place in it. Um, that idea of simultaneity uh, is, for me, one of the reasons that the physical model is so useful because in a digital model, no matter how good it is generally, and maybe with AR and VR that will change, but in general, you're still looking at a two-dimensional representation. No matter how much you spin around it, you're only seeing the thing that is in front of you. As you move from one space to another, you, in a way, forget that space that you just came from and concentrate on the space in front of you. With the physical model, all of those spaces are there physically at the same time. And so in your conceptual peripheral vision, the space that you just looked at or the space that you anticipate looking at next is a part of this larger continuum of relationships. And I find that really provocative, very useful. Um, uh, a more complete understanding of the way that we actually um, experience our world today. So we make many, many models, many iterations, um, at many different scales, but always with the same ambition to study what the relationships between all of those pieces are of the composition of the project, of the architecture, um, in a kind of simultaneous real-time way.
And so the model comes before a sketch, or the sketch comes first?
You know, the beginning of a project can come from almost anything. Um, I'm not so strident about what um, the first move is. I'm paraphrasing John Cage, but he said something to the effect of, when faced with the impossibility of beginning, begin anywhere. And I think that there's a truth to that. So in the beginning of a project, it can be a sketch, it can be an image, it can be something that somebody said casually, it can be um, uh, a, a, an element in the site or the context. Um, for me, it's important that it's just something that relates to or seems to relate to or has some resonance to the project, because really all I'm trying to do at that moment is um, have something on that sheer cliff that you're facing to grab onto, some kind of handhold. And once you have that, then um, then I think the process of of starting to respond to that, working through multiple iterations in the model, begins to have a more natural trajectory to it, a more continuous trajectory to it.
Would you say that standing on a particular site, visiting a particular site is more or as important as your last project, which is maybe located in a different part of the city?
Um, I think it's very important uh,
The site.
because one of the things I'm looking for in architecture is to find um, what the particular characteristics of that place might be. And I use the term characteristics intentionally, as opposed to talking about place and context. Um, again, coming out of uh, how I um, coming out of the particular moment in architecture when I was in school, context was a very important term, especially in postmodernism. There was an idea that you could create uh, significant and durable relationships to the place by understanding the context in a way and relating to that. Um, what that began to mean was that um, often you looked at what the formal characteristics of the buildings were around you, and you repeated those or maybe interpreted them, abstracted them some, whether it was the cornice of the building or the geometries of the windows. And it's not that those things aren't important, but growing up in a in a suburban context and then coming to Los Angeles um, uh, and being a part of this a similar suburban post-war uh, context. Those um, those elements, those formal elements, the history of those elements don't really exist here in the same way. And what um, I found was that uh, there was a kind of um, there was a kind of um, fiction in trying to pretend that um, those classical ways of relating to the city worked in these contemporary cities. Um, but I re, uh, but my experience has been that in a place like Levittown or in a place like Los Angeles or in other contemporary cities, there are characteristics that are sometimes more abstract, more ephemeral. The type of light, um, um, the kind of prosaic repetition of buildings and houses, the speed of movement of the highways, the way in which infrastructural elements become the identifying characteristics of a place, that they are just as profound and important and useful in thinking how you might make relationships between the thing you are making in those types of cities. Um, so when I go to a place, I think I look for um, those characteristics, those qualities or qualitative aspects of the place, no matter how abstract or fugitive they are, because I actually think that they're often more profoundly uh, the things that relate to people's actual experience of those places. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, but there is also, and I think you mentioned it before, that there is some kind of, and you can see it very profoundly, there is a continuity in your work. And I just wonder how much it is a continuation of a particular project. Like, for example, I asked our Caesar how he starts.
Hmm.
And he told me right away, as soon as he gets a phone call, he starts. And
Hmm.
he says, I have no idea what the site is. I never been to that city. I start.
Hmm.
And then he said that most likely 100% that all of the sketches are good for nothing. They're gonna go straight to wastebasket. But he said, I can't help it. I have to start right away
Hmm.
before I get to see the site for the first time.
Hmm.
And this probably has to do with the fact that in his case as well, for sure, it's a single project,
Hmm.
all of his work.
Hmm. Uh, I don't. I imagine that most architects um, likely have uh, a similar reality in terms of starting. There's no doubt that from the moment you receive a project, and maybe even well before that, when you're even pursuing a project, you've heard about it. The moment you even have any sense of it, inevitably you uh, start to have a series of ideas and probably preconceptions that um, uh, that you that start to filter into your mind. And I think those are important because it's really about jumpstarting some connection to the project. It's a way of it's a way of starting to connect to um, uh, in your mind what the fantasy of this project might be. Uh, Sometimes that um, turns out to be reasonably accurate. Just as often, it turns out to be completely 180 degrees away from how you eventually understand the project. But it gets at this very important piece, which is uh, that I think as an architect, um, your mind needs to constantly be involved and intertwined with your larger project.
Yeah.
It's like a writer saying that they have to go in every day and write, whether they use the writing or not. Because the moment you step away from it, the moment that you create a break
Yeah.
in that,
You trust it.
at the very least, it's extremely painful, very difficult to come back into it. So I think as architects, and probably in almost every creative discipline, you're always working on this longer term continuous project that is yours. Um, and then the specific task at hand, which is a part of uh, um, that larger project, but also with its own specific needs and requirements and ambitions.
Yeah. And even if you start a project without knowing all the details and then you realize that it's not gonna fit this time, you might come back to it 5 years later, right?
Uh, yes, and um, if you were to walk around the office with me right now, you would see dozens and dozens and dozens of physical models at all different scales. In many cases of projects that never were realized. They're
Not yet.
important for me to have
Not yet.
around.
Right? Not yet.
What's that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, that's exactly it. That
Yeah.
they are a part of your um, storehouse of ideas and vocabulary. They are a part of that continuous project and represent, even in their unrealized form, ideas that um, can be reused, can be reinterpreted, can be rethought.
You have said housing is a microcosm of the city itself. If you could elaborate on that.
Um,
And
I
is
don't think this is, I
specifically
don't, th
housing, or this could apply to other types as well?
well, I think it starts with the increment of, I think it starts with the increment of the house itself. Um, this is not something, this is not a new or radical idea. It goes all the way back to, uh, for instance, Alberti writing about the relationship between the house and the city. Um, uh, it's, I do think that um, a house, especially, is at any moment a kind of perfect distillation of all of a kind of condensation of all of the mechanisms um, that make up our lives. And if you extrapolate that, the city is as well. It's really the scale that changes. Uh, so for me, the thing that is so um, continually fascinating about the house and housing as well is that uh, whenever I'm personally fascinated, whenever I'm working on those projects, I feel like I'm really thinking about the city simultaneously. of course, a housing project very often sits in the city, and so there are relationships that you're making between the community and the individuals who live in a housing project and the city that surrounds it. But I think you can look at them very specifically as examinations, experiments of what a response to the contemporary city is, and maybe even what a more idealized city can be.
You have a reputation as the go-to architect for both art collectors' houses and affordable housing. How do these projects inform each other?
Well, I wish more people would go to me for those things, but I don't see them as
a line of lines.
You know, I don't see them as being different, at least in the way that I work. If, again, you were to walk around the office, you would see that all of the different program types, whether it's a housing, affordable housing, projects for institutions and individuals who have much greater resources, they're all interspersed amongst themselves. There isn't a housing department and there's not a museum department, for instance, in the office, because they are all a part of that larger project we just spoke about, and they influence each other. I think they should influence each other because they're all significant parts of the culture that we make. If we think about them, for instance, affordable housing being a highly specialized and distinct form within our culture and communities, by its very nature, that type of thinking isolates those projects from their larger relationships. It isolates them both for the communities that live there, but also for the communities in the city. And I think we have to be very cautious and even aggressive as architects to not allow for those lines to be created between social and economic and physical relationships. That in cities where you see different groups, communities isolated from each other, siloized from each other, the frictions that are created, but the damage that's created in those communities, those cities, those cultures, is really profound and takes enormous efforts to unwind. Los Angeles has been a very useful lesson in that way. When I first started, it was right around the time of the Rodney King riots. And Los Angeles had always been described as a multicultural city because so many cultures live here. But what became a reality when those uprisings took place, and the uprisings moved across a lot of the physical and psychological boundaries that, in fact, had been in place in the city. What you realized was that the city wasn't really a multicultural city. It was a city of many cultures living separately and apart, and that those hierarchies and structures were significantly responsible for a lot of the problems, a lot of the challenges, the seemingly intractable inequalities that existed in the city. So I think it's incumbent on architecture to look for opportunities to dissolve those lines or to make clear where those boundaries and frictions take place, and to approach those in more generous and potentially positive ways, to find ways to make bridges across those lines. And I think that that has to occur in the form of the practice that you design as well. How do you intertwine all of these seemingly separate and unrelated projects? On the surface, they're unrelated, but I think underneath it all, there are deep connections that need to be thought through, to be critical of, to understand.
So is the idea that when you approach in a particular building, the idea is that not to reveal what type it is?
No, I think no. I don't think it's I don't think you can do that. But I think you can use the tools of architecture to do exactly the opposite, to challenge a lot of the preconceptions and expectations. For instance, in the permanent supportive housing that we've done for formerly homeless individuals, when I first started to do that work, the first couple of projects, I heard a lot of criticism from people that the projects had too much architecture. Why were we making buildings for those communities that had such strong architectural ambitions? At the time, those criticisms, really made me angry, really pissed me off, because, of course, I thought, number one, why would you undervalue the people who are living in that building to such an extent that you would think that they should get a building that you intentionally tried to minimize the design quality. But even more so, I thought it was such a ridiculous idea that as somebody who lives in the city, you wouldn't want each element that was added to the city to be as good a building, as strong a piece of architecture, as contributing a part of the physical scape of the city as possible. And why would you want to make something in your city that was a piece of crap? Why wouldn't you want it to be great when you could? And I think that's a place where architecture, for instance, can have a profound role, to use one of its tools, which is to actually make something look like something, to have it have a strong presence, to make sure it has an insistence in the city that challenges that kind of preconception, that kind of expectation about who gets architecture and who doesn't get architecture.
I want to ask you about the Pittman Dowell House. what were some of the intentions behind it? And I understand that you played with at least 25 different variations before you came up with the final solution, right?
Well, that would be the case in almost all of our projects, that we go through many, many variations,
Okay.
to the consternation of the business manager here. But Pittman Dowell, for me, was a project that goes exactly at the question we were talking, or the thing we were touching on before, about the relationship of the house and the city. Um, and um, and the form of the house really representing much larger mechanisms that are at play in our culture. The owners, Larry Pittman and Roy Dowell, two painters, successful painters with very public lives, lived in a house designed by Richard Neutra in the 1950s, the Cyrilnik House, which was a kind of quintessential post-war Neutra house, glass on the exterior, highly transparent, and intentionally trying to blur that line between inside and outside, which I think is a romantic modernist idea, but one that didn't necessarily relate to our contemporary realities. And what I mean by that is that Larry and Roy started to feel that because of their the public nature of their work, and they were both professors in art departments, so they were also that work was very public. They really are public makers and public intellectuals in the city, nationally, globally, through their work. That increasingly they felt this sense of constant exposure, and that the contemporary issue for them was, again, this sense that the lines between our public and private lives have been largely dissolved. And the Neutra House was, over time, almost an exacerbation of that problem with that sense of transparency. When we started to work on the new house, which is adjacent to the Neutra House and down the hill a little bit, I started to think of that house as kind of the alter ego to the Neutra House, where maybe the exterior would become a more opaque line between the outside world and the inner life of the house. But then that hyper transparency would be the spatial model on the inside of the house. And so if you look at the images, or if you were to visit the house, there are really no doors between spaces. The divisions between the majority of the major rooms are glass, so that you see from the bedroom across a courtyard immediately into the living room, completely open to each other. The bathroom, which is one of the most private spaces in the house, is directly at the front entry, and also looks into those other rooms. There's a sense that when you're within the confines of the seven sides of the exterior of the perimeter, that the typical divisions between programmatic spaces, as Larry Pittman once said, the Catholicism of the traditional house that becomes more dissolved. And that sense of simultaneity between different parts of one's life starts to be explored spatially, physically in the house. In a way, it was really the house was an experiment around trying to represent uh, what a, what our contemporary life actually is and what the spatial form of our contemporary life is.
I wonder if, you made 25 different iterations, but did you show them every one of those 25, or you just showed the 25th?
We should probably, there were two parallel tracks. There were two forms that I was interested in. One I was less interested in, and the one that we eventually moved forward with, which was the one that I was by far the most excited about. Um, uh,
But
we
you
showed
showed
them
both.
we showed them both,
Okay.
and we talked about it, and which was dangerous because I really wanted to go with one of them. But I wasn't trying to convince them um, or somehow hypnotize them and get them to do the scheme that I wanted to. We talked very honestly, very openly, very directly about what each of those schemes, potential
So they
schemes meant.
came on board with the
They
one.
gravitated immediately to what really was the more uh, I think challenging and ambitious of the projects, which is the one that um, we developed.
The last question I have is, what are your current preoccupations? What are you trying to achieve next? And are you anticipating any breakthrough?
I come into the studio every day anticipating a breakthrough. Um,
Okay.
uh, I leave the studio every day, sometimes with a breakthrough, sometimes not. But I think I'm wired to come in every day believing that some breakthrough, or maybe just an evolution forward. I feel like I'm at a moment where I'm looking as much going back to some of the formative ambitions um, that I looked at in that were really driving the beginnings of the work, and trying to understand that um, from a different point of maturity, because in some of those in those some of those initial ambitions around architecture's ability to um, challenge and create provocative relationships around a kind of directness um, uh, in the way of making spatial, especially spatial experiences, um, around a kind of approach to um, uh, a way of even building projects in a quicker, more direct, less expensive way. Um, Things that were necessary as well as in the beginning, as well uh, as as larger ambitions you dreamed about in terms of architecture's abilities. Uh, I think um, I've been looking at at those because I think they're very fundamental to who you are as an architect. Of course, your work evolves over time, and your capabilities as an architect certainly evolve over time. But I also think it's extremely important um, to to keep trying to access um, what for you as an architect are um, the um, the ideas and possibilities, um, the optimisms that you have or had um, as as primary motivators in your work uh, to create a kind of directness um, with with what you as an architect, how you as an architect see the world and want to operate in the world. That sounds very broad, and again, maybe even a bit um, abstract or general. Uh, but I think we're at a point in architecture where if you look at uh, the media of architecture, if you look at the images, the projects, I'd like to say the magazines, but they don't, and the journals, but they don't exist as much anymore. If you look at the constant onslaught of architecture, I think it's reasonable to ask, um, has architecture um, become too good? Uh, if you look at the projects, whether it's a museum or whether it's a cafe or whether it's a little installation or whether it's uh, a large university building, it's incredible. It's extraordinary what architecture as a formal practice has been able to achieve.
Yeah.
One building after another is is a tour de force, is incredible imagery. Even the smallest project that somebody has done for a coffee shop would have been the most radical project we could have imagined 25 years ago. And so, in the face of a discipline, architecture, that formally has become so good, um, then what's the problem? And I think that question of what is the problem for architecture is really important. At least it's really important for me. Um,
Don't you find it ironic that, it seems like architecture is getting better and better, and because we are getting constantly more and more informed, and there are all these inventions, and then you ask the architects, what's your favorite building? And guess how far in history they go back instead of forward. Instead of saying, last year there was this building built in such and such. No, they talk
Right.
about, like you talk about, Baramini's buildings, right?
right.
So where are we moving?
uh, I think you have to move forward, but moving forward doesn't mean that uh, that architecture is completely disassociated with its past. Um, I think it's less important to it's less important um, to look at the historical architectural forms, and more important, I think, to look at what the um, the deep ambitions and motivations for work throughout the history of architecture have been. One of the things that we have as a rule in the office is that whenever we're beginning a project and it's a particular program type and we're pulling a series of precedents to look at what that program type is like, for instance, a theater. The rule is that no precedent can be newer than 12 years old. I actually think it should be older than that, and I may make that number 20 years. It's a completely random line of demarcation, but I think it's very difficult to look objectively at work that is of our moment and to be able to discern anything critically from that that can be useful in pushing the conversation forward. I think the lenses that we see it through, see things from our moment, are never a critical enough lens. There's not enough distance.
Yeah.
When I think about a work like Borromini's work, or any work throughout the history of architecture, throughout the many histories of architecture, across many cultures, looking at that work from a distance is not to look at it aesthetically, to look at the work in terms of its stylistic qualities, but to look at it with a critical lens in terms of what new types of relationships might you be able to use by reinterpreting that work through your own critical lens and the moment that you're working in, through the questions that you're asking in at this moment. If you're asking questions, contemporary questions of a work built 200 years ago, you're likely going to develop different interpretations than the architect who was making that work 200 years ago. I think that's useful. I think that's where the discipline of architecture is still very important to our ability to push at the expectations of our moment, at the hierarchies of our particular moment.
Yeah, it's also important to have a conversation with the contemporaries because, you just said 12 years, and 12 years, that's a long time because, for example, in those 12 years, for example, the relationship between architecture and landscape completely changed, completely.
Yes.
And we're now paying much more attention to what's going on in the countryside. And we're working a lot with traditional materials. So 12 years ago, it was very different. Very different.
It's true. It is true, but I think that those I think those contemporary the understanding of, for instance, the blurring of architecture and landscape architecture is something that we somehow implicitly understand now. And you're inevitably going to be looking at anything through the lens of your the understanding of your contemporary moment. I don't think that's ever the issue. The issue is then how you find a way to add something unexpected or at least an evolution into the lexicon of contemporary ideas, to move that forward. If we keep looking at the things that are made yesterday, then I think architecture inevitably becomes deeply self-referential, and even further isolated from architecture's potential role in having a cultural, social, political, economic effect.
Okay, thank you.
Intense.